Good afternoon. My name is Danielle Parker, and I'm the Director of the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Repairing and Reglazing Historic Wooden Windows. I am joined today by Kelsey Romer, who is an AmeriCorps member for the Appalachian Forest National Heritage Area's hands-on team. Throughout the webinar, if you want to ask any questions, you can send them in through the chat, or you can submit them through the questions tab, and we can answer those at the end of the webinar. So I will be handing it over to Kelsey. Thank you for joining us today, Kelsey.
Thank you. Happy to do this. Thanks everybody for attending. Like the rest of these webinars, this was really supposed to be in person with you, a real hands-on workshop at the PAWB conference this past spring. But I'm hoping, even though you won't have a chance to really get your hands dirty and practice these techniques, I'm hoping this will still be a nice, helpful guide for you later on when you try to repair your windows. So first of all, who even are we? What is Appalachian Forest National Heritage Area? If you have never heard of the organization, it's based here in Elkins in Randolph County, West Virginia, and it serves these 18 counties highlighted here. I'm going to depend a lot on my little pointer here today, so follow along with that. So yeah, it's an organization that really tries to promote and highlight what makes this Appalachian region so special. So it focuses on these core themes here: conservation, forestry, cultural heritage, asset-based tourism, and community development. And one of the ways that it's really able to do that is through its AmeriCorps program. Basically, each year, AFNHA places about 40 AmeriCorps members at partner sites throughout this region, and they're able to really help serve their communities and help carry out that mission. So that's where the hands-on team comes into play. The hands-on team is a group of AmeriCorps members, and since 2007, the AFNHA has been able to put together a group of 4 or 5 people as a construction crew, basically dedicated specifically to historic preservation projects throughout this area. I've got a link to the website there so you can look us up and check out more about the organization, but this is us. This is the current hot crew. This is me on the right. Hi. So we do a lot of different work, but what we specialize in really is this historic window repair, as well as some plaster and some masonry projects. But just this year alone, just this crew from 2019-2020 has repaired over 100 window sashes. I tallied them up. So the 9 sites that we've worked at this year, we've gotten quite a few windows under our belts. So all that being said, why do all of this work? Why repair your windows instead of just going and buying some nice shiny new vinyl ones? I think I'm lucky enough to already be addressing a crowd that understands the importance of historic preservation. You're all here today because you are already invested in that. So I don't think I have to work too hard to convince you why keeping these historic structures intact is so beneficial, but you know, they're really important to your community story, especially with the architectural structure itself. Those windows can be a really significant element, one of those defining characteristics when you look at a building. And they can be, you know, part of the original structure. If they maybe exemplify a particular period or style that really defines your area, or the opposite, if it's a really, really unique building for your area, and that kind of tells a special part of that story as well. Or maybe they're made by local craftsmen or something like that. There's a million reasons why keeping these historic elements in place are really important for your story. Secondly, the eco-friendly side of things. This is one of my favorite parts about preservation. There's this maxim that gets thrown around a lot in the preservation world, which is the greenest building is the one that already exists. And this kind of comes from Carl Elefanti, who's president of the AIA, and he wrote a lot about this, but it's this concept that you've got so much material, energy, and resource consumption already bound up in a building that's already there on site, that even if it's got some damage, even if it's, you know, a little dilapidated, by retrofitting that and kind of bringing it up to functioning standards again, you're gonna make much, much less of an additional environmental impact and have a much smaller carbon footprint than if you were to tear that whole building down, throw all of that material into a landfill, bring in backhoes, tear up the site, you know, really do a lot of damage, disturbing that soil and that, you know, ecology there again, harvesting all new materials, getting new wood and brick and stone, and then not to mention the fuel consumption, you know, shipping all of these items to you, getting everything in place. So if you kind of limit how much new amount of material and resources you're consuming, you're going to be doing the much, much more environmentally friendly option. And I included a link here. If you Google that phrase or this topic, you'll find a lot of studies that give you some better numbers on this. That links to one that the National Trust did a couple of years back with their Preservation Green Lab. But basically, it kind of says that a building will take upwards of about 80 years to kind of pay off its environmental debt with all of the footprint and energy that goes into it. So if you've got some of these historic sites that are already, you know, 100 or 200 years old, they've more than paid off that environmental debt. So you're doing a much smarter, responsible option by just retrofitting these buildings and bringing them up to a working standard again. And they're going to be pretty much just as energy efficient as a new building when you add a little bit of modern tweaks to them. Keep in mind, these old buildings were designed to last. They're designed to breathe, they're designed to last, so it's going to be a happy and healthy environment for you. So you've decided to go ahead with this project. Where do you start? What is step one? So first of all, establish your goals. Primarily, that's going to mean your budget. Just like everything else in life, your budget's going to answer a lot of the questions as far as what you can do. And this is both money and time. How much time can you invest in this project? Not just how much money do you have to spend on materials, but that's going to determine the level of repairs you can do. Did you suddenly win the lottery and you can do an absolute A to Z beautiful restoration, or are you maybe a small town museum and you operate on a shoestring budget anyway, and you just need to really do some bare bones repairs to get it functional? So establish that. Do you need to meet Secretary of Interior standards? This is going to be more of an issue if your building is registered, if it's on a national register list, or maybe it's in a historic district with some really strict codes and covenants or something like that. Basically, if you are beholden to anyone, an organization or anything that is particular about what materials and methods you can use, that's going to be a big part of this as well, versus if you are a private homeowner or something and you've got a lot more leeway and you can use any materials or methods that you would like. Kind of going off of that, this restore or rehabilitate, when you get into the Secretary of Interior standards, it's pretty specific as far as what type of action you're taking. So if you are rehabilitating your windows or the structure as a whole, you're still caring about the historic nature of it and trying to keep it in kind, but you are a lot more flexible with what materials. It has allowances for modern materials because you're trying to mostly keep it functional and allow for some adaptive reuse. But if you are doing a restoration, that's when you're really, really going to get kind of particular, because that means you are taking it back to a certain time period, either when it was first built or a period of significance. So more likely than not, if you have a registered building and you have to meet these standards and you do a restoration, you're going to have to use a particular type of hardware or type of paint or type of mortar and something. You're going to have a lot more strict standards. So once you understand the scope of what you have to accomplish in your project, you're going to have a very clear idea of what repairs you're going to make. So once you know that, go ahead and get all your tools together. So it's a pretty basic list here. To get your sashes in and out of the wall, you're going to need a 5-in-1 scraper, rubber mallet, some pliers, hammer and nails, drill and screws, something to write with, scraping the paint and getting the glass out, more of some good carbide scrapers, both a flat head and some profile shaped heads. I'll show you pictures of those in a second, don't worry. And some to get the paint off, some heat guns and some sandpaper too. Glazing, get the actual glazing compound itself, that putty, as well as some glazing points, putty knife, linseed oil, some shaping tools like some chisels, utility knife, razor blade, and then some calcium carbonate powder and a clean brush to apply that with, and some clean rags. Now, before you get all gung-ho and dive in, take pictures for reference. Trust me, you will thank yourself later because you think you'll remember where everything goes, but I can tell you from personal experience, it doesn't always work. So stop and take some pictures as you go along, document where everything was placed, label the pieces, take that pencil and go ahead and discreetly somewhere write, this is from window to left side, something like that. So that way when you go back and put everything in, it's really, really simple. Now, I should have put this one first because really before you touch or move anything, you should do a lead test. Windows and doors really commonly have lead paint on them. So hopefully you caught the lead safety webinar last week that Logan Smith did. He's actually my supervisor and he's going to be on with me at the end of this to help answer any questions. But if your paint is lead positive, then that's going to totally have a whole different ball game and determine what you need to do during this process. So for this example today, we're going to assume that the paint is lead negative, no lead. So, I'm going to have to use some specific terms as we go through this. So I wanted to start with this little diagram here to help get you a better picture of what I'm actually referring to. So if you start here on the right, this detailed one, this is a double hung window, meaning you've got these two independent sashes that move freely from each other. You've got your upper sash here and your lower sash down here. Now, on a sash, the top and bottom pieces are called your rails, where they meet in the middle. That is called a meeting rail. Those two rails are called meeting rails. Then the side pieces here are stiles. So in the sash, you've got rails and stiles. This little strip that you see right here, that is called a parting bead. And that has a couple of functions. One, it allows these two sashes to be separated from each other so that they can move past each other, kind of keeps them apart, hence parting bead. But that also helps act as a stop for this upper sash here. And you'll see stop in this diagram a lot. Right here, blind stop. So basically when it's something that's called a stop is there to literally stop the window, like from falling out. This blind stop here, or an exterior stop, you can call it, that runs along the length and the outside, just like this parting bead does, but it's on the exterior. And that is there to stop the window from falling outwards. So when you put this sash in, you're putting it up against that piece. Then you move on to the inside. This parting bead is there along that to keep it from falling inside. You're gonna tack that parting bead right up there against it nice and tightly. There's a third one that it's not shown on this diagram, but right about here in that little corner on the exterior, there's going to be another stop. and that's going to sit directly under the sash and keep it from falling downwards. So that's going to stop that one there. Then you've got this fourth stop, this kind of trim piece right here that goes up and down on the inside. That's an interior stop, and that keeps this bottom sash from falling outwards. So again, going back over, you've got sashes, you've got parting beads, and you've got stops. Then you've got these little strips right here that are inside of your sashes. Those are called muntins, and that's what this diagram over here to the left is. And this is where most of the action is going to take place today that we're talking about with this glazing. So this is a nice little cross section of it. This primary part here, that's your actual wooden muntin strip. The lower half here is on the interior side. That's why it's got this molding profile. This is your more decorative side on the interior. This upper half here, that's what's going to be on the exterior and actually be braving the elements. So that's why you've got all of this glazing there on the outside. So when you look at this right here, this rectangle piece that comes up, that's your glazing bar. That's going to come down to make a corner with this glazing rabbet. And that rabbet is what you're pushing your glass down onto. It's kind of the shelf that all of this is going to be sitting on. And then that bar comes up, and that's what you're going to push that glazing putty up against to finish that seal and make that all one airtight unit. So now that you have a better sense of what I'm referring to when I use these words, kind of keep those diagrams in mind, you're ready to get started. So removing a window, it's pretty simple because you're going to just start with the outermost pieces that are, towards you and work your way inwards. I've got a little video here that's going to help show this while I talk. So you're going to start with that inner stop, and you're going to take your 5-in-1 and just kind of work it in there with that rubber mallet in slow, even increments all the way up. So these trim pieces are really long and thin and flimsy. So if you take one whole side out of it, like near the bottom or the top, and try to pull it, it's just going to snap like a twig. So you want to work your way up slowly, up and down that in even increments, really focusing on where the nails are tacked in. So you'll take that stop off of both sides, and once they're gone, there's not really anything holding this bottom sash in. It might be a little stuck, especially if it's got years of paint and grime and stuff on there, but you can just kind of pop that out next. Then you're going to take out your parting bead, which is that little bit right there that you can see. Again, that travels the whole length up and down, so you're going to remove it the same way as you would this long stop. You're going to do it nice and slow, even increments all the way up so that you don't snap it. Next, there's this stop right here. And this is that one that I was saying you couldn't see in the diagram, but that sits directly below your upper sash, and that stops it from falling downwards. And this is gonna come in a few forms. You can have a block, you can just have like a peg. I've seen them in a full trim piece that goes all the way down. So look for, a few different options, but that's what that is there to do. So you'll pry that out next, and then at that point there won't be anything holding your top sash in. So be prepared to support that as you start taking all these stops out. Be prepared to support your sash. It's very unlikely that it's going to be so loose that it just falls, but it can happen. So just be prepared to kind of have a hand on that and prop it up as you take the stops out. But once the stops are gone from both sides, you're good to just pop that upper sash out too.
Hey, Kelsey, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we had a question come in about the diagram, and I thought maybe you could just go back and point that out really quick.
Okay.
It says, what is the part that sits right under the rail called? that is in between the sill and the stool?
Under the rail that sits, you say that one more time?
Under the rail that is in between the sill and the stool.
In between sill and the stool. Is it this subsill piece or the one that's going along this edge here? That's called your apron. But I think if you're referring to this one here, that's your subsill. So that sits like underneath of the sill.
Okay, yes, she says the very inside of the window.
I think that means one of these two. This top one right here is technically your sill. You can kind of follow that up. So that top one is your sill, and then this one here is your subsill, the more kind of substantial piece. I hope that's the right part you're asking about.
Thanks, Kelsey.
This is Logan jumping in there real quick. You'll find different parts for different window constructions, different casements. Some of them have been rebuilt a few times. We ran into this just recently. Typically, your sill runs from the exterior of the casement on the exterior of the building all the way back through to the interior part of the building, or into the interior part of the casement. Sometimes you'll see a little piece in there in between that has been used to make a transition or make a change in the slope of the thing. Sometimes the sill will come in flat and then slope down. That's all considered part of the sill, running all the way back to the apron and the stool. So the stool should rest directly on the sill. The bottom of the rail, the bottom rail of the window should come all the way down to the sill, and the sill should extend all the way out to the exterior of the building. Anything that is pieced in there in between often is something that's happened later, or just used as a transitional element to the sill to change the direction of the slope of the sill.
Okay. Does that answer the question?
Move on. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, good. I'm glad we have questions. This is good. Thank you. Okay. So, yeah, I was here. Okay. So once you get all of that out, you're gonna want to cover those window openings, obviously. Best bet here is plywood. You can use really heavy duty plastic sometimes, but plywood's definitely the most secure, and it's going to be the most weather tight. You're going to want to attach that plywood to the exterior of the building, because that's going to help prevent any rainwater from rolling inside into the frame and then getting in between the frame and the plywood. And then you can physically attach it from the exterior if you would like I'm doing here on the left, and just screw it into the frame from the outside. Or if it's on, an upper level story, or if you are more concerned about security, this option here on the right is probably a better bet. This is something where these 2x4s that go horizontally across here, those would not be in place when you first start. They're going to be loose and they're going to swivel. So you're going to be able to maneuver this sheet of plywood outside. You have to install these from the interior. So you're going to be inside, maneuver that plywood out of the window to the exterior, get it positioned in place, and then once you do, you can screw these 2x4s in place horizontally. And that way it's really locked into place. You've got the plywood putting pressure from the exterior, and then the 2x4s are putting pressure against the frame from the interior. So it's all nice and tightly locked in there. So you've buttoned that all up. Now you're ready to actually work on the sashes. So first step is scraping off all the old paint and glazing. And this is where making those decisions earlier about how thorough you wanted to be, about, you know, how much of this project you were going to invest time and money into, you can take 10 minutes and just scrape off the loose paint chips, or you can take a few hours and scrape every bit of paint off of there and get it down to bare wood and do a complete restoration. Same with the glazing. You can take all the old glazing out, take all the panes out, clean them up, and do a nice uniform reglazing, or you can just focus on those spot repairs. Just kind of patch the spots where it's missing and go back over where it's cracked. So again, knowing that moving forward will determine how much scraping you want to do. Really, when it comes to that paint, there's no reason why you have to take it down to bare wood. If that paint is still bonded to the frame, then it's still doing its job. It's still sealed and it's still protecting that wood from water getting into it. So if you're finding that you have to really, you know, muscle that scraper into there to get that paint to come off, then there's a good chance that you might actually cause more damage to the sash, because you're, you know, going to really rough up that wood trying to scrape so hard. Or if your muntins are really fragile because you haven't actually repaired them yet, then, you know, sometimes you might even crack some of those, you know, where the joints are or something like that. So be cognizant of that. Unless you're trying to do a full restoration, you know, one brand new paint job, looking pristine, it's okay to leave some paint on that sash as long as it's firmly attached. So to do the scraping, like I said, you're going to want those carbide scrapers or a handy dandy 5-in-1. That's this guy right here. So that's for the wider flat surfaces, your stiles and rails. But when you get to doing those muntins or any little nooks and crannies, you're going to want these guys. These are the profile shaped heads I was mentioning. Something with a point for a little more detailed work. But do be careful. These scrapers are sharper than they, you know, you might think, and they can very easily get away from you and gouge your sash. You know, you kind of lose your track you were going on, and the scraper slips away and leaves a big mark down the sash, which is not great. I'm guilty. I've done it once or twice myself. But for that reason, you do really want to be careful. And if you've got a sash that has some really either intricate or valuable detailed woodworking on it, maybe you've got some really detailed muntin profiles, or you've got some rosettes on your sash or something like that, some kind of really detailed work, that might be a time where a chemical paint stripper would be a better option. We haven't personally worked with them much this year, but if you are worried about scraping away the definition of that detailed woodwork, then you could very easily consider a chemical option as well for removing the paint. When it comes to the glazing, you're gonna either use that trusty 5-in-1 again, or one of these zipper tools. It's got a serrated edge, so it's really handy at breaking up that glazing. So the trick with both of these is you have to have them flat on the glass. Lay them flat on there. You don't want to dig your edge of these sharp tools down into the glass, because you don't want to scratch down into it. You don't want to etch it. If you're using a lot of force, you can even crack it easily, especially if you nick a glazing point or something like that, and kind of put a little too much force into it. You can definitely crack that glass. So just be gentle, keep it flat on the glass, and take your time working into it. If you're finding that you do want to take your sash down to bare wood and that paint is just being really stubborn, you've got a couple options. So one's a steamer box. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a big box made normally of like styrofoam or insulation or something like that, and you put your sashes in and fill it with hot steam. And that moisture and heat is gonna infiltrate into that paint seal and kind of loosen it up for you. It works really well, but do be careful, because as it makes that paint softer, it's going to do the same thing to the wood. That wood's going to absorb the moisture, and it's going to want to get really soft. So when you scrape it after that, be much more gentle than you were before when you found out that it didn't want to get scraped. Because now that paint is going to be so soft, and all of those little individual wood fibers are going to kind of be really pulpy and want to come up and get that feathery, fuzzy texture to it. So just scrape with the grain, be gentle, don't overdo it. Probably the more realistic go-to option for people is going to be a heat gun. Just nice and simple. Hold it over the paint about 20 seconds or so. But when the paint bubbles, you can see that it has broken that bond against the wood, and you can scrape that off, and that'll work on your glazing as well. Do be careful though, because if you have a drastic temperature difference with the glass, like if you have your glass in a cold garage maybe, or something like that, if you point a heat gun directly at cold glass, that sudden temperature change can also crack it too. So keep all of that in mind. With the glazing, when you start to try to remove your glass from the from the sash, make sure that you actually have all of your glazing points out. It's really easy to miss them because they get kind of buried in the glazing and gunk and get discolored. But if you're finding that when you put any pressure on that glass and pop it up, or try to pop it up and it doesn't want to go, then there's a good chance you've still got some glazing points holding it in there. And the more pressure you put on it, it's also probably just going to crack that glass in half right where that point is holding it in. So especially double check for, they're not really points, they're trim nails. I've found this a lot in the windows we've been working on. It's a really common vernacular trick because trim nails are really common. Everyone's got them lying around if you're doing this sort of work. And they're just long enough that if you tack them all the way through the glazing bar, they can hold 2 panes in at once. It'll hold them on either side of the mutton. But they're so thin, they're so small that they're really, really easy to miss. So keep an eye out for those and just triple check that all of your points are actually out before you try to move that glass out of there. Once everything's out, go ahead and just hit it with some sandpaper, get it nice and smooth so that way your paint looks good when you do that at the end. So now you're ready to actually start repairing your woodwork, the actual sash, and that means consolidant and epoxy. So these things are absolute godsends. These are wonderful products. They're what's really gonna save your sash and bring it back to life. So you can see they're both 2-part products. You're gonna mix each of them with their part A and part B, and there'll be a chemical reaction that takes place. So you'll start with your consolidant first. That is for if your wood has gotten a little bit of rot and it's gotten soft. The term I hear a lot around here is punky. Basically, if you can kind of stick your fingernail down in there and it goes into the wood, then probably from water damage, then it's a little too soft. Or if it's the opposite, if it's kind of dry rotted and gotten some sun damage and it's brittle and splintered. Both of those, you're going to want to use some consolidant, and that's a liquid hardening agent. So basically, you will mix it according to whatever ratio the product suggests. You're going to brush away any of the rotten wood off of that sash, get all of that gross stuff out of the way, and leave as much of that healthy wood intact as you can, because that's going to be what you build off of to finish it up. And then take your consolidant and pour it down in there pretty liberally. You use a brush to spread it around, but that liquid consolidant is going to get absorbed into that wood. And as it cures, it's going to harden all throughout that wood and really firm it up again and seal it. So while you have that out, I mentioned here, go ahead and put it on the corners and the mutton joints. When we were first learning to do these windows, someone told us you have to learn to think like water, because water is your biggest enemy here most of the time. So basically, understanding that water is going to want to get trapped in any sort of little holes and crevices and cracks. So these corners and the muntin joints are really susceptible to water kind of sitting in there for long periods of time. So even if they look okay, even if the wood is healthy, it won't hurt to just dot a little bit of that consolidant on there while you already have them out. So do that, let it all dry. Next is the epoxy. And this is a solid product. It's putty, like Play-Doh. So you're gonna use this if the wood has any holes or missing sections, or if you maybe got a little scraper happy and you gouged out some lines. You're gonna use this epoxy to go back and fill everything in and get it kind of smooth again. Now, the trick with this, mix it together, again, part A and part B, mix it together, and you're gonna wanna really smear that into that hole and make good contact with all of that surface area you're trying to fill. If you kind of just shove a ball in there, but don't smush it all around, you're just gonna wind up with a hardened ball of epoxy sitting in a hole, which is not what you want. What you want is that epoxy that has actually been adhered to that wood and is a continuation of that wood. So make sure that you really smear it all around and get good surface contact, and then keep packing it in. I'm not gonna lie, the epoxy is gonna look a little ugly at first when you first get it in there, because it's really sticky. It's not going to easily mold into something that looks the way you want it to look when you first apply it. So you kind of have to put on extra and then shape it down, which is not hard. It's really shapeable. It'll carve and sand just like wood. So go ahead and pack it in, have a little extra on top, and then smooth it all down and shape it how you need to later. Especially pay attention to the edges, because paint is wonderful and paint will hide a lot of things, but if you have a really obvious edge instead of a smooth transition, you will kind of be able to see that through the paint. So make sure you just sand those edges really well so that it nicely fades into the rest of the wood. You can see here I've got some pictures of things we would use this for. These muntins are pretty rough. It's like you're looking at a mountain ridgeline instead of a glazing bar. So, and you can imagine how difficult that will make it to reglaze if there's no glazing bar to push the glazing up against. So this one here is just even completely gone. We had to actually chisel out that little line there in the middle and kind of make a channel to push the epoxy down into to give it a place to sit and start adhering to things. But this is something that we were able to bring back, so even these are not too far gone. This one down here in the lower left, that's a consolidant fix. There is a little hole here that we probably patched with some epoxy, but you can see right here there's still a pretty nice intact straight line. It's just that this wood has gotten kind of soft and feathery and needed to get firmed up again. So as I said, the epoxy is a little rough looking when you get it all on there. It's gonna be just like some Play-Doh, but this bottom half, we're not even done with it yet at this point. We just started carving it there, and you can already tell it looks much, much better. You can get this in any kind of shape that you want, really. So don't be afraid of it. You can see on the right-hand side here, this sash had a lot of kind of deep cracks in there along the grain, so we just smeared some epoxy along the whole length of it to kind of fill it in. And then once you sand it down, there's still some ripples. You can still see the grain in there. That's kind of nice because it's going to match the rest of the texture of the sash and kind of still have that historic character look to it. Now, all that being said, sometimes you really just need to replace some parts. This one that I've got here, I'm not putting much effort into this at all, and I am shredding it with my bare hands. It was pretty bad. And with a situation like this, you could try to, dunk that in consolidant, but really you're risking the rest of the window, because if you leave that failed element in place, the rest of the window is going to start failing to compensate for that. your glass is going to start shifting. That means your glazing is going to start cracking. That means your muntins are going to start rotting because of the water. So it's all just a big domino effect. And while fabrication might require some carpentry skills, I think that's probably not a problem for a lot of you listening. I think you're probably a lot of handy DIYers there at home who could do this yourself pretty easily. If not, you will have to find someone that can, but I will say it is definitely worth it, because replacing one or two parts right now can save you from having to replace the entire thing later. And keeping all of these historic pieces intact as long as possible is the goal, right? So it's worth it in the long run. You're ready to start dealing with your glass once your sash is brought back into good working order. So you're going to make your measurements from the inside of the glazing bar to the inside of the glazing bar on the opposite side. You're going to take that and then subtract 1/8 of an inch, so that way that glass will fall down in there nice and easily. You still want it close to the glazing bar, but not too tight. Take multiple measurements though. These old windows, again, they warp, they bend, they get out of square, so don't ever assume that any of these are perfectly 90-degree square angles. Go ahead and take a couple of different measurements so you know what size you need to make this glass. So once you have that, go ahead and draw out your dimensions on your sheet and grab your glass cutter. I've got two different options here that we use. It's pretty simple one here, this red one on the left, that's your cutter wheel at the top, or this self-oiling kind. It's going to help you make this cut if you dab a little bit of linseed oil there on that cutting wheel. But you're going to do this, place a straight edge there along your line to help guide you, and you really want to do this in just one firm pass. The glass is not going to like it if you try to go back and forth and retrace and go up and down. It's not going to break cleanly. So you really want to put a good amount of pressure, start at the top, and just make one firm pass all the way down. And again, that oil on there will kind of help bring that down into the glass as it goes. And you'll hear it. It's going to make that kind of awful nails on a chalkboard sound when you dig into this glass, but that's a good thing. That means it's working, so keep doing that. If you pick it up, it should kind of snap without too much effort, hopefully. Wear eye protection. We don't want anyone losing an eye from any shards that shatter off or anything like that. But if it doesn't snap easily, then take, you can see here at the end of this glass cutter, some paint's missing, because you can take that and just kind of tap, tap, tap down along that line. And that kind of jarring force will help extend that crack through the rest of the glass. And it should snap for you at that point. Once you do that, you're ready to bring it over to your sash and hope that it actually fits. So you're gonna place it in here, and at the very least, you need it to overlap the rabbet on all sides. Fitting tightly against the glazing bar is great, but at the very least, you need contact so it overlaps the rabbets, or else it's not going to be airtight and not actually sealed. If it doesn't fit, don't panic. Just first of all, just try rotating it. You'd be surprised how often that works. Again, these sashes are old and not perfectly uniform, so a tiny bit of variation here or there means if you just flip it around, try it a different direction, you'd be surprised how often that'll work for you. Also check the sash for gunk and stuff that might be in the way, either some old glazing or some new epoxy you just put in, something like that. Make sure that it's a cleaned up area there. At that point, if it still doesn't fit, if your glass is just actually the wrong size, you've got a few different avenues. If the glass is too small, you really just kind of have to cut a new piece of glass. There's not much you can do about that. If it doesn't overlap the rabbet, you just need a bigger piece. So set that one aside and start a new piece. Or if this current piece of glass is too big, then you've got two other options. If it's a significant amount that needs to come off, like a 1/4 inch or something, just trim down that piece of glass. If it's something a little smaller, like a 1/16 or maybe an 1/8, something small like that, it's going to be a little harder to trim that glass, because when you put pressure along the edge, trying to take just that small amount off, the edge of that glass is going to want to more crumble and disintegrate instead of snapping in a clean line. So it's going to make that kind of jagged. If you're talking about that small of an adjustment, something that minor, then you may want to work with the actual wood itself and kind of either sand or carve that out a little bit. Again, this is really for a minor adjustment, because the wood has to be able to withstand that loss. You can see here, these glazing bars in this photo are very thin. I would absolutely not recommend taking anything else off of those. If you scrape a little bit off of that at this point, there won't be anything left. So that is definitely not a good option for that situation. If it were a little too long and you wanted to take it from this rail down here, then you've got plenty of material to work with, but keep in mind, you're not doing this in a vacuum. You've got the two panes on either side, and if you wanted to take something drastic off of here, it's going to be kind of noticeable and look a little awkward compared to the ones on the left and right. If you wanted to take like a 1/4 inch off of this, and it's suddenly very different than the one next to it. So this is really just for minor adjustments if you want to take a little bit off of the sash there. Once you get your glass to fit, it's time to actually start placing it. So you're going to bed it. Bedding is just your glazing compound. It's the same material. So first, prime your sash. It all needs to be primed, even what's under the glazing. So do that, let it dry, and then just use your fingers to go ahead and spread that bedding around the rabbets. Put a decent amount, because you want to make sure that you get this full seal. On this picture, you can see the color difference here, where you can see the bedding, but it's not actually touching the glass, versus this here along the edges. It's nice and smushed up against there. So you get that good full seal. So do that, and you're ready to point it to keep it in place. Gently set it down in there, and then kind of push it tight towards the rabbit, and then that's when you put your points into the sash. And the points will either be manual, ones that you insert by hand with a flathead or a putty knife or something, or ones that you use a point gun for. And that's what we use. I've got another video here. We use a point gun. It's very simple. You squeeze the trigger and it does it for you. And you can see here to the right, these ones that go to that gun are diamond shaped. So the other half of it is inserted into the sash. The ones that are manual, they'll have a flat edge, and that way you can push up against it with a flathead or putty knife, and there's little prongs that go into the wood. Basically, for all of these, what you're looking for is that the point is inserted far enough into the sash that it's secure. There's no wiggle room. It's nice and tight, but it also overlaps the glass, so that way it keeps it securely in place, because these points are going to add stability until that glazing dries. So they're there to keep that glass from moving. You also, though, want to make sure that your points are the right size for your rabbits, because you also don't want them to protrude past the rabbit line. That's what this is. You're seeing it through the other side of the glass. If you protrude past the rabbit, it's really just for aesthetics. From the outside, you're going to cover it with glazing anyway, so it doesn't make too much of a difference. But from the inside, keep that rabbit is where your sash ends. So if your point is way out here, you're going to see that through the inside of your glass, and it just won't look as neat and clean. So number of points, that'll change depending on the size of your glass panes. If you've got a small pane, you just need 1 or 2 per side. If you've got a whole sheet, if your whole sash is 1 pane of glass, then you're going to need maybe 3 or 4 per side. Again, better safe than sorry, because it is there for stability. So you do that. When you push the glass into place, it's going to smush all that bedding out of the bottom of it. So go ahead and grab that off of there and clean it up. And then you're going to use that for the glazing. Now we get to the fun part. And by fun, I mean it is the most frustrating part. I won't lie, it takes a lot of practice. You just have to get used to the feel of it and kind of figure out the techniques that work for you. It'll be really frustrating, but you will get through it, I promise. So you're gonna take a big ball of that putty and just kind of work it in your hands, get it nice and soft and pliable. If it's a little dry for your liking, add some linseed oil into it, and then you're gonna roll it out into a snake along the glazing bars of your pane. So you can see here, I'm gonna smush it really nice and tight into that corner. Again, this is all about seals. You want to make sure there are no air pockets back in there. You want that to be nice and tight up against the glazing bar and the glass. So really smush it into that corner. Clean off your knife again, because you want your knife to be clean here. Oh, hold on one second. Technical difficulties, but don't worry. Believe it or not, this did happen in my practice, and I prepared for it. Yeah, so I can get this fold back here. There we go. There we go. Okay, so clean off your knife, get it nice and clean of any residue, and now you're gonna start the actual glazing pass. So I'm gonna play this while I talk, but I'll tell you right off the bat, this first pass you're gonna see me make is really, really bad. It's going to look atrocious. I kept it in there on purpose because it's really handy to see what you don't want. But don't judge me for that when you first see it. So you're going to start at the top of the glazing bar, and you're going to make a triangle with one point down on the glass, one point back on the glazing bar, and you're going to pull it at a slightly upward angle backwards. But look at how jagged and gross that is. That is not what you want to see. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to jump forward here to when I make another pass. I'm going to pause it. So see all of these little tears and rips there along the edges? That is, again, a problem because of water. Those little pockets are exactly where it's going to want to sit and work its way under the glazing and cause you all kinds of cracks and issues. You want a good, clean line because that means a nice seal up against that glass. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. I'm going to do a second try. Again, get yourself positioned, pull it back, even pressure, nice upward angle. And you can already tell that is a way, way cleaner line there on that one. There's a little bit of ripple down at the bottom there. That's okay with these sashes. Again, they're not uniform. So you're going to hit a little bump in the wood here or there, and that's going to translate to a ripple in your glazing. That's okay. You can smooth it out in a second, and I'll show you how. Right now, I'm just cleaning off that excess along the side. I'm getting that out of the way so I can see a little better. Be careful with this step because there's nothing worse than when you finally get that good glazing pass and then you accidentally bump it and take a big chunk out of it and have to do it all over again. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this next one. So with that pass that I just had, it had a little bit of ripples, and it was a little chunky, the texture wise inside the actual glazing itself. So you can fix that with just a little bit of linseed oil. Just really lightly, kind of graze over it with your finger. It's really soft still, so you're just gonna kind of delicately go over it and smooth that out. This being said, linseed oil is not a substitute for just a good glazing seal. You really kind of need that glazing line to be able to stand on its own and have a good clean line there at the bottom. But that linseed oil is really great for kind of prettying it up and smoothing it all out at the end. So you can see I'm making another pass here to kind of help clean that all up. I'm gonna pull up at the end to make that corner. You're gonna have to work on those corners a few times by the time you do the next bar and meet the corner again. But just for the bar you're working on, again, go back, smooth it out a little bit. If you jump to here, so I'm going to take a minute and clean up the edge again like I did in the previous video. If you jump forward here, then you'll be able to see that this looks a lot cleaner and tighter. So again, clean lines. It's a little wavy overall, but again, that's because the sash itself is not a perfect straight line. It's got some crumbs on it, but those brush right off. The actual glazing itself is pretty decent. So I'm gonna do that as many times as you need to. The glazing is not going to set immediately. You've got plenty of time to work with this and keep going over it until you're happy with it. You're gonna do that on each side of the pane, all 4 sides, or just whatever areas you need to patch if you're doing spot repairs. The corners are probably the most frustrating part because you're going to get one side perfect, and then when you do the other bar leading into the corner, you're going to have to go over the part you just got perfect. So it's a never-ending back and forth trying to get that corner nice and tidy. But 3 hours and a few choice words later, don't worry, you will get it right and you will be very happy. When you get that how you like it, you're ready to finish up with some calcium carbonate. And this is part of what glazing is made of. It's this and linseed oil, so that's why these materials are okay to use. But when you brush this powder on, it's just going to clean up that excess oil off the surface and help get any little crumbs and bits off the glass. It's going to help clean it all up there. Use a clean, soft, bristled brush for this because, again, that glazing is delicate. So you're just going to really lightly brush that calcium over top of there and get it nice and clean. So you're going to see in 1 second when I pull the camera in, I've got some good corner lines. You're going to want that for aesthetics. You want a nice clean corner line, but also, again, to channel that water away. It's going to kind of act like a funnel and help divert it down and out instead of more of a swoop. If you just connected it, that can act like a bowl and kind of hold that water. So there you go. That's glazing. When you get it to a point you're satisfied with, you're ready to just let it dry. Now the hands-off part starts. Leave it in a warm, safe space, high temperature, good airflow. It's going to help this cure as quickly as possible. Normally, it depends on the product, but normally it's about 1 to 4 weeks, somewhere in there. It's ready to paint when you can feel a nice firm skin on there. Don't push your finger into it. It's still soft. It'll take months and months for this to fully set. But if you can run your finger over it and feel a skin, then it's ready to paint. I left this diagram in here to again remind you, just get a little view of what you want this to look like in the end when you have all of these elements in place. It also kind of shows you some of the reasons why caulk is not always recommended. It's going to do exactly what you want it to do right at first, but over time it's going to fail much more quickly. It's going to pull away from the sash and glass, let some water in. It's got some problems. So we can talk more about that if you have any questions. So last but not least, painting. You've already primed your sash, so go ahead and just put a couple of good thick coats of paint on there. Again, sealing it to make it watertight is the name of the game. When you do this, you really, really, really want to make sure that you leave this 1/8 of an inch border on the exterior. Extend from the glazing out onto the glass an additional 1/8 of an inch. And that's again because you want to do everything you can to keep water away from your glazing. So the paint's inevitably going to, chip, paint, crack, peel that paint's the first thing that's going to fail. So if you leave that border there, that's just extra layer of protection to keep it away from your glazing. To get these nice clean lines, you can use painter's tape, of course. That's the problem that's going to happen with that, though, more likely than not, with latex paint, is you're going to peel that tape up and you're going to peel that latex paint right up with it. That rubbery quality of that paint is just going to want to kind of peel up. And that's not as big of an issue on the interior. Worst case, maybe it looks a little sloppy, but on the exterior, that's a big problem because of what I was just saying. You really want to keep this border here. And if you peel that tape up and this takes a big chunk of paint away, then you're right back at square one with your glazing exposed. So what we do is we paint pretty liberally over onto the glass, like an inch or two, and then come back later with a straight edge and a razor blade, and we put that straight edge down about 1/8 of an inch away where we want it and score that paint with a razor and break that paint line right there where we want it. So that way when we come back and scrape away the excess, we can go right up to that line, and that break will help keep it from peeling too close to the glazing. So the very end, once you have paint on your sashes and they're all dry and pretty, you're ready to reinstall them. This is a before and after shot of a building we're working on in Beverly. It's the Bosworth building. But when you reinstall the windows, it's basically the exact same thing as taking them out. You're just doing it in the reverse order. So you're going to start with your upper sash. It should hopefully slide up pretty easily because you've removed a bunch of, paint and grime over the years. So it should go up pretty nicely. If not, that's why you've still got that rubber mallet handy. You can just kind of convince it to go up in place. So you'll start with the upper sash, put in those stops that go underneath of it, do your parting beads on the inside, put in your bottom sash, and then those interior stops that trim. So once you do that, you're good to go. You did it. Hooray. Now you're just on to maintaining them. Just keep your eye on them, look for any cracks or leaks, water or bugs, anything like that that kind of shows exposure to the outside, and really keep an eye on the paint, because again, the paint is your first line of defense against all of these elements. So repaint them as often as you need to. You can see it really does make a dramatic difference. Looking pretty shabby, and then this nice bright white curb appeal here on this side. So it's a lot of work to do this, but once you do, you'll be able to enjoy these windows in your building for another 100 years. So yeah, that is everything that I've got for you. Like I said, Logan Smith is here with me to help answer any questions you guys might have now, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelsey. We did have one other question come in while you were speaking earlier, and it is, I'm sorry, I'm reading an old question. What are some of the historic buildings whose windows you have restored?
Yeah, so we've done quite a few this year. Like I said, that building that you just saw, that's the Randolph County Historic Society Museum. It's in Beverly, the Bosworth building. So we're still finishing that one up currently. We just did a lot of work on the Travelers Rest building in Kaiser. That's a very cool place. We're pretty happy with those. That was more of the in-depth restoration. We took those down to bare wood and really worked on those. There's also the Pleasant Green Church down in Hillsboro. And that was a really cool project. We loved that. It's a historic African American church, and those windows had some stained, it's called root beer glass. It's like a yellow color, and it was really kind of marbled and textured. So we got to work with that glass. That was really neat. We loved that project. So there's been a few others, but yeah, we've been around.
The next question is, what glazing are you using? Do you have any favorites?
Yeah, so and I should know this off the top of my head, Logan, if you can remind me the brand of that glazing. I want to say Abitron, but I think that's the epoxy name.
That's the epoxy. We use Sarco.
Yeah.
Sarco. And the two things you need to know about Sarco, if you're going to put the sashes back immediately, you can use the Sarco dual glaze. It takes it a while for it to actually harden, but it's great for exterior projects because you can actually put it back in place while it's still wet. If you want something that's going to set up more quickly but not be quite as resilient to the exteriors, but we use a Type M, which is the Type M, Sarco Type M, which sets up nice and quick. It seems a little odd, but it sets up quicker. It develops the skin quicker. You can paint it quicker, but it doesn't cure in the weather as well. So you have to kind of keep it in your shop for the week after you've painted and so forth, trying to keep it out of the weather. But so Sarco is what we use. We tend to steer clear of DAP 33, although that's the common glaze available at Ace Hardware. You can get Sarco on Amazon now, but it's a little more expensive than most, but it's a good product.
Okay, thank you guys. That was the last question that had come in, and then a comment of thank you for an outstanding and practical presentation. I hope that the AFNHA will consider similar presentations and educational outreach as a part of our strategic and master planning. Let's see, one more comment here. Someone has a comment about that you did not address weighted windows and storm windows. Did you guys want to share any comments about weighted windows or storm windows before we conclude?
Yeah, so I had a feeling that someone would have a question for this. Yeah, we haven't personally worked with them this year that I've been with the hot team. We've only done the work that I've described, but that's one of the reasons I wanted Logan here. He's got a lot more experience with this, so I'll pass it to him.
We run across a lot of windows that have had pocket sashes, or I'm sorry, pocket weights in them in the past. Usually by the time we get to them, those have been taken offline. Oftentimes the ropes have just been cut and the weight's allowed to drop into the weight pockets. That's why you'll see a lot of stops on the top sashes on the windows that by the time we get to them, they've just been blocked up from the exterior. If you want to work with and restore weighted windows, feel free. You can buy sash cord very, very easily. Finding the pulleys and getting them functioning again can be problematic. Usually the weights are still in the weight pockets, and you can salvage them. Sometimes where you have to get way down in there to get them. It depends on how far those pockets have. Because often, lots of times, the previous people that have worked on the sashes will just cut the cord and let the weight drop down in there. But if anyone has specific questions about working with weighted windows, weighted sashes, feel free to email us. I don't know if you have our information here, but I'd be more than happy to answer individual questions on that. And then the other part was, what was the other part of that question, Danielle?
It was storm windows.
Storm windows we're a big fan of. From the Secretary of Interior's perspective, if you're talking about adding storm windows to historic windows, that's a highly great thing to do. Because typically they're very removable. Lots of times the vintage storms are typically metal that will go over, but they save the original frames. They're easily put on and taken off. So we're big fans of storm windows. There's several different variations of storms that you can do. You can do interior storms now as well, so that they don't affect the look of the building from the outside. And several of those, I've even seen some now that are all plastic, and they just snap into place on the interior of the house. And they're very low profile. They sort of fade away into the framing of the interior of the frame. But the beauty of the storms in general is that they'll protect the entire sash, all the old sashes. So I have an old house myself, and we did all the windows, and then put high quality, low profile storms over all the windows. So they cut they increase the R value of the house enormously, and protect the original materials.
Okay, one more thing that has come in is I have just restored an arts and crafts bungalow in Charleston and found storms. I have been doing restoration for 60 years and have 2 homes on the registers. Thanks for a great presentation. And she has a video on the Luna Park Historic District, so maybe that's something that we can try to get more information out there. That would be located in Charleston. And that came from Shauna Stedman. So those are all the comments and questions that we've had come in so far today. I would like to thank you again to Kelsey and to Logan and the Appalachian Forest National Heritage Area for joining us today. This webinar and information will be available on our website at pawv.org if you would like to view it later on and share it with your friends. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.